A tiny kitchen, no oven, a minuscule fridge, no electric power, a small 2-burner hob, and prep space the size of a chopping board. Lots of us think we have small kitchens, but imagine cooking nutrient-dense food in these circumstances. That's exactly what our guest today, Charlie Burton, did for her husband, and her 2 young children for 2 years, all whilst travelling around Europe. Listen into this episode to hear how Charlie cooked 3 meals a day and lived in a 6.5 metre long van, and what advice she'd pass on to all of us with limited space. How she managed to find really good food on the move despite cultural and linguistic challenges. The beautiful food highlights of her time, including an amazing ancestral-style heaven in Slovenia. How she regularly made pizza with no oven. The constraints and restrictions she experienced on the way, and how both of these things can actually support us to live and cook the way we really want to. Let's go. Welcome to the Ancestral Kitchen podcast with Alison, a European town dweller in central Italy, and Andrea, living on a newly created family farm in northwest Washington State, USA. Pull up a chair at the table and join us as we talk about eating, cooking, and living with ancient ancestral food wisdom in a modern world kitchen. Hello and welcome to another episode of the podcast. I want to start by saying thank you to our community of patrons who help keep us going. If you're interested in diving more deeply into the world of ancestral food that we're sharing here, Andrea and I, check out our page over at Patreon, which is patreon.com/Ancestral Kitchen Podcast, to see how our wonderful community works. We actually had a new patron just yesterday, Nick Campbell. So thank you ever so much for coming on, Nick, and looking forward to sharing and getting to know you. And if you love this episode and it brings you value, please do share it in some way and help us get the word out. Post about it on Instagram, tell a friend, take a screenshot, share it. Everyone who tells the world that they love what we do helps us to find more people for the podcast, which is a win-win. So to today's episode, we have a guest today who is Charlie Burton. And Charlie is a mum, an entrepreneur and a passionate local food advocate who I've never actually met in real life, but I've met virtually. The first time we met was in 2014 when my son and her first daughter were really very young. And I was in the UK then, and I was searching for like minds, parents who were eating and feeding their children with whole nutrient-dense foods, like I was trying to do with my son Gabriel. Charlie, who's got 2 daughters now, found me back then, and we struck up a virtual friendship. And then I went on to kind of kickstart a Facebook Western Price UK parenting group that Charlie is now an admin for and has been since back then. And for many years, I followed her life and her food adventures on Instagram. And the reason that I wanted to get Charlie on the podcast today is because in 2018, she, her husband, and her 2 daughters set off on the most amazing adventure, travelling around Europe in a van. And as we go through the episode, she'll explain all the details. Suffice to say that both Andrea and I were super excited about having her come on and talk about her travels, how she sourced good food in various different countries with different languages, and how they managed to cook it for 4 people in a tiny van. So welcome, Charlie. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here with you today.
Tell us, the first question we always ask our guests is, what was the last thing you ate? So tell us that.
So in the UK, it's about 3:00, and so the last food that I ate was my lunch, and I had a simple lunch of scrambled eggs with eggs from our own chickens, and I had that cooked in some homemade wild garlic butter. My husband foraged the wild garlic from a kind of woodlandy meadow bit not far from our house. And I just had that on some sourdough rye, which is bought in, not homemade at the moment. And I had a fermented gherkin as well. And that's also something that I've bought. Oh, and a glass of raw milk.
How many chickens have you got? Oh, lovely. How many chickens have you got? Tell me about your chickens.
We've got 6. It was something that we were really keen to bring into our life when we finished our van adventures and came back to house life. Animals and chickens in particular were one of the things that we really wanted to get. So they have a large kind of penned off run at the end of our garden, which is a big garden. We do live in a kind of quite urban, suburban area. So we're trying to bring a little bit of that kind of life into the city.
Yeah, some real animals. Nice. Tell me about the garlic butter. How do you make it? Do you buy the butter and then put those foraged garlic in it?
I did, yes. Yeah, just very simply just chopped the wild garlic up and sort of mashed it into the butter. And then...
okay, so you don't have to melt the butter. You just kind of have the butter at room temperature, do you? And then, then mash the garlic into it?
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds delicious. Do your girls like that? Do they like wild garlic?
They don't complain. They haven't complained about me putting it in food. They're very used to me putting green sprinkly things in food. So I often put herbs in food. And I also use like the seaweed sprinkles in a lot of food, very much like I do salt and pepper really. So they're quite used to me doing that. So it's not too alien for them.
Yeah, I think that's the key. Kind of if you're doing it often and you're doing it regular and you're doing it from a young age, then it's not anything unusual, which is really cool. Okay, so let's talk about your adventure. First of all, tell us about your family and then tell us about the trip you went on, why you decided to go on it and where you travelled to.
So, as you mentioned, I've got my husband, Nick, and I've got 2 daughters who are now like 4.5 and 8.5. And back in 2018, we were living in a really beautiful place. We were renting a lovely kind of farm cottage. It was called Dairy Farm Cottage, which, as somebody who loves raw milk and things, was such a romantic place to live. It was beautiful, but there was just something that just felt amiss in our lives. I'd had a really like sort of tricky postpartum after my first baby. I'd been running my own business, and it was the whole birth experience and postpartum was really challenging, and it just really shook us up. And just things just didn't feel quite right. We were living in this beautiful place, and I just didn't really feel very happy or content there. So it was a really big decision to leave it, because it was lovely and it was the kind of place I thought I wanted to be. But we, for various reasons, we decided that we would go and travel around Europe in an old motorhome, which we bought, and we completely gutted it and rebuilt it. My husband primarily rebuilt it. And when my second daughter was about 9 months, we left our house. We put the remaining belongings we had into a storage container, and we spent a few months at my parents' finishing the van off, because we still hadn't finished it off. And then we left in the beginning of July 2018. And it was very much an open-ended journey. We didn't have a home in the UK anymore. And we always said if it was like 2 months or 2 years, whatever it was, it would be the right thing for us. And so we had our ferry ticket and we set off to France, and we really didn't have anywhere to go. So it was very much, we turned up in France and we just sort of looked at the map and found somewhere that, we could get to for the night. And it just went on like that, really, with a few kind of deadlines. we really wanted to get to the south of France to go watch the Tour de France, and then we had a date in Italy where we were meeting up with my parents. So we had a few things like that. But that's kind of how our journey went. And we ended up doing that for nearly 2 years. And we spent the majority of our time in France, but we also spent quite a bit of time in Italy. And we also went to Slovenia, Switzerland, Germany, Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands over that time period. Some of that we had to come back for the odd month here and there in the UK. But yeah, so yeah, it was...
So both you and your husband were able to do that kind of work-wise? That's not a problem for you to move your work and do that as you were working?
So my husband, part of the choice to do that was for my husband to have a break from work, to just sort of reassess what he wanted to do and to spend more time with our children when they were young. That was something that we were finding difficult in the life we were living. It sort of, we couldn't really sustain it. It was just that lack of family time, really. And then I have an online business, so the plan was that I would be able to do that while we travelled, and I would obviously have my husband there to take care of the kids while I worked. But it didn't really work out like that because we had a really big emotional, kind of psychological journey, me in particular, through that kind of that leaving, and it just brought up so much stuff, and I didn't really do a lot of work in the end. It ticked over a good percentage of what we needed, but we did eat into our savings a little bit every month. So that's how sort of financially we did it.
It's really interesting that you know, when we make these big jumps and leaps of faith in our life, that we have a plan and we think, oh, well, yeah, that'll work out like that. And it's so easy, it has been for me, to just kind of neglect the thought that actually big changes create big changes emotionally, and then we have to process those. So it's interesting to hear, you know, that for you that moving and changing your lifestyle like completely had fallout. I think often we kind of, particularly as women, we can think that we just need to move on, you know, well, now we're a mum, okay, we've had a kid, we should be able to just slip into this life. But it doesn't work like that at all.
No, it's it was, I think we thought it was going to be this certain vision of van life, which is, there's a lot of wonderful, beautiful images on Instagram and things like that, and I think we just thought, well, it's going to be amazing, we're going to be together as a family, and that might be a bit tricky to start with, but it brought up so much stuff, and at different points for my husband, he went through a couple of months of difficulties, and I had my time, and it definitely brings up a lot doing something like that.
Tell us about the space, the actual van itself, how it was organised, how big it was, and then what cooking facilities you had in there.
So our motorhome is 20 years old, and it's about 6.5 metres long, which my husband said is about 10 square metres kind of maximum if it's empty, and obviously that's got stuff built into it, so hopefully that gives you a little idea of what kind of space it was, size wise, which was quite tiny to fit 4 of us in, and like a whole mini house in it. So we had in there, we had a tiny kitchen which had a 2-burner gas cast iron hob, and a tiny fridge which is about 50 litres. We had no running hot water, only cold water from a tank under the van that we had to fill up. We had a composting toilet.
Okay.
We then had a double bed over the cab and like a sitting area where we ate dinner. It then transformed into what I called like a day bed, sort of like a sofa-y sort of thing. And then at night that then extended out to become our second bed. So we were, every single night we had a day, we had to make up and put down beds.
Gosh.
And then we had solar panels as well to help us with our kind of power. So yeah, that was kind of like the space in a nutshell.
So no oven at all, just literally 2 hobs, no oven.
Yeah, yeah. And it was like,
Okay.
I adored my kitchen in that van, and I still miss it. It was, you know, because we built it ourselves, it was, you know, in a lot of ways
Yeah.
how I wanted, and having that cast iron
Beautiful.
hob was something I was really keen to have, because I like cooking with cast iron, so I needed something that was going to stand up to cast iron pans on it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And what surface area did you have to chop?
probably like a large chopping board size space.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Gosh. Did you do all of your prep in the van, or did you have kind of good weather and space to put table and stuff outside and be outside and do prep and stuff out there as well?
I think quite a few people do that, and we probably definitely could have done, but when I think back, I don't think we really did. I think I did most of it in the van. I think I preferred to get the children and my husband out of the van,
Yeah.
and then have the space to cook inside. We had made our dining table so that we could screw on short legs to make it into a table that we could have outside, like a floor level kind of table. And I think we did that once, and then we didn't do it again. So yeah, we didn't really have a setup for cooking, for preparing outside. So I did most of it in the van.
I can kind of get that, because you know, once you've got that space and you know what you've got, then if you can get everyone else out so they're not under your feet or in the way, then there's a way of creating a system in the space that you have. So I kind of understand that. Whereas I've tried to prep outside quite often, and you know, people are all around you, and you haven't got what you need, and there's flies and there's wind, and it just, sometimes it's more hassle.
Yeah.
It's better just to be in your small little space.
Yeah.
So what I'm most interested in is finding out how you got access to good ingredients, because you're in countries that you don't know, you don't necessarily speak the language. I mean, in any of those countries, it's not like travelling, you know, around the US where everyone speaks the same language, and all the cultures are really different as well. So tell us about how in those countries on your journey you were able to get good food.
So I think my main experience was that Europe was really easy to find good ingredients and good food, and I don't know whether that's me. I guess in unpacking this, with speaking it through with you, we'll maybe see whether it's particular to the things I did, but I feel like just knowing where you need to look and what you're looking for is helpful, and then it can be found everywhere in our experience. As I mentioned, we spent a lot of time in France. I think over the sort of 2 years we travelled, we worked out in total we spent about 8 months in France. And the markets in France, they're on really regularly. Most towns, villages, they seem to be on. There are lots of kind of expat websites that you can find sort of listings of all the markets in a particular region. So I think, you know, if you know the region you're in, then or the town, you know, it's easy to find that information. Often I think the squares in those towns often will have a sign that tell you when the markets are. So so finding markets in France, certainly, and we also found them in Italy, just didn't seem to be a problem. And they're just so full of just incredible seasonal, local, regional produce. It was just a treat, really, for somebody who wishes she could have that access the whole time back here in England, which it's a bit different here, I think, compared to a place like France. So
how would you say it's different with the markets? Because I know there are farmers markets in the UK. What's your experience of the UK market-wise compared to what you found in these European countries?
I think perhaps they're a bit more few and far between, and I think a bit more hit and miss with what you might find. So I've definitely been to some of the larger ones where, you know, you find all kinds of produce, vegetables, baked items, dairy, meat, all, you know, big variety. But then perhaps some of the smaller ones might be more baked items, so more like cakes, desserts,
see, yeah.
breads and stuff. And I think for me, what I found in Europe is that huge amount of choice of produce, in terms of like vegetables and fruit and dairy, like the kind of the basic ingredients rather than like necessarily like made food.
Yeah.
And for me, that's what I'm looking for. So I think that's probably the main differences for me, and why I loved being in Europe so much for the markets.
And was the language a problem at the various markets you went to in the different countries?
I don't remember it being. We just picked stuff up. It was definitely the best way that I've ever learnt, like picked up French, compared to my experience of trying to learn it at school, to actually be in the country and spend time in it was by far the best way to learn. So, standing in queues, you would hear how the French are asking for things, so I would pick up bits from that. And we did have a basic grasp of French, certainly. And, just being able to know like a few kind of key amounts, or how to say slices, or kilos or grams, pointing if you really were stuck. But I think in the markets we definitely found like that we got by. All the other countries, we didn't really have any knowledge of the language, a tiny bit of knowledge of Italian, but I still managed to buy things in markets in Italy and Slovenia and places like that. So I think, if all else fails, pointing is okay in a market at least, so, and hand gestures. So.
And what were the highlights of looking for food? All these countries that you went to have their own individual kind of legacy of preparation methods and ingredients. There must have been some amazing things that you saw and witnessed and ate.
How long do you have? I have so many.
Tell us the best ones.
So I think it's probably worth mentioning that in Italy and Slovenia, if you're interested in raw milk, that both those countries have vending machines for raw milk, and there is definitely a website for the Italian one in terms of finding those, which I use quite a lot.
Okay.
So I just think that's such a helpful thing to know, because it's so much easier, really easy. I didn't expect to find raw milk as prevalent as we did when we travelled. But in terms of specific highlights, so I asked my family as well if they had some particular highlights. So my husband, Nick, one of his food highlights was a meal we had in a place called the Val d'Orcia in Tuscany, in Italy. I know through my wedding directory a family who run an agriturismo there called Il Rigo, and she made a rabbit dish for us. And from my memory, I think it was like rolled with herbs and then maybe like covered in like almost like a prosciutto style ham. And so that was the one that Nick particularly remembers.
Okay.
For me, there was also in Italy, we went to a cafe that was recommended by a garage when we were visiting a garage, one of our numerous breakdowns. And we asked for like we wanted a local place, and often people will try and tell you like pizza places or like the touristy places, and we said no, we really want a really local place, and they sent us off to this wonderful place. And I just remember this fantastic ribollita. Am I pronouncing that right?
Okay,
maybe?
Yeah.
So like beans and vegetables kind of soup. So I remember that one really, really particularly. And my eldest daughter, her highlight is one that ties into probably one of the highlights of our trip. She remembers a particular kind of beef broth or kind of consomme, a very clear beef soup with these homemade noodles that we had in Slovenia. And we stayed at this farm in Slovenia that was not far outside the capital, Ljubljana. And we went there to camp in the van and discovered this incredible farm where pretty much everything was grown and made on the farm. There are vegetables, meat, drinks, like, everything. And it was like a window into another world, really. The night that we arrived in the dark into their farmyard, and there were these spotlights, and like the whole family was out, and they were, if this is the right term, they were shucking corn. So they had all the dried corn.
Wow.
So this was in October time, and they were shucking it all as a family and putting it, I guess, aside for like the winter for animals, which was just blew my mind when we arrived to that. And they were just the friendliest family. There was fresh bread baked every day. They made their own charcuterie and liquors, and they had apples that they pressed to cider, and then they would make vinegar from them. So we saw them pressing those apples. They had these big trays of sliced mushrooms. I guess they would have been wild mushrooms that they were drying outside in the sun. It was just the most incredible food experience. And on the weekends, they would do meals. It seemed very popular with local people would come there for a meal. And so we went off and explored another bit of Slovenia, and then came back again because we particularly wanted to come back and eat there again.
I'm not surprised.
Just to eat a whole meal that is literally produced from the place that you are, by the people, the family, I think was just blew my mind, really. Just, it feels like that's, life wasn't, not long ago, that's how we were living, and I would just love to get back to that and to experience it happening in modern day Slovenia was really special. So
yeah, what an incredible experience. Like you said, it wasn't so long ago, but that was the norm. And I think when we go and have a glimpse into these things, we can feel it in our bodies. We feel the energy and the love and the creation, and it brings so much.
Yeah.
I want to go there. Did you bring stuff back? Not physical stuff, but have you tried recreating some of the stuff in your kitchen at home with the recipes you tried? Or have you changed any of your techniques in your kitchen because of what you saw?
The ribollita, I definitely went off to determined to try and like sort of, part way recreate how good that meal was. But I made it quite a few times because obviously, as I mentioned, we didn't have an oven, which I didn't need for that dish, but we did, to break up our journey, we did this like house and pet sitting. So we would have like a week or a couple of weeks in someone's house. And I remember making that ribollita quite a few times when we were house sitting in in a big bulk amount, which I couldn't really do in the van. But in Slovenia particularly, I brought back... their tourist office had these incredible leaflets about their food traditions with recipes, and I've still got those somewhere. And there was this bread, which was like a sweet bread with sort of rolled with tarragon in the middle, which I thought was really unusual that we tried there. So I'd love to do these things, and you mentioning it makes me feel like I need to go and dig those out and try a few of those. But I think just having that access to fresh food, like on a sort of very regular basis, which I don't have in the same way now, for me that really drives my passion for cooking, and so I'm probably lacking a little bit of that at the moment. How to capture that.
I get that. I know the difference between how I feel in the kitchen when I was living in the UK to how I feel as a creative in the kitchen here in Italy, and that part of the reason, very small part of the reason that we came here was because the food is just, it's more beautiful, it's more available, it's more tasty in it, and people generally take much more pride in it. And I know that affects me in the kitchen, so I can completely understand how having all that around you or not having access to that around you would change how you want to express yourself, certainly. For sure. Okay, let's go back to the van now. Now we've talked about all these fabulous ingredients. you've got a tiny fridge, and I'm guessing no freezer. You've got two ring burners on a cast iron hob. You've got no oven. So how often were you cooking, and how did you do it in that tiny space for all four of you?
So we mostly were cooking three meals a day, which is how we cook, living in a house. I don't really tend to, we do buy in, meals sometimes, and we do eat out occasionally, but I just carried on with what I knew, which was, making our meals myself. And I imagine that, thinking back, we probably, lunches were probably quite simple, just sort of like that sort of picnicky, nibbly bits. But yeah, definitely just carried on cooking despite the small space. And I just found ways, I just got into a rhythm with it, and I had those wonderful fresh ingredients, so I wanted to cook with them. I remember previously going on holiday to France and just overbuying at markets because I would just see all this stuff and just think I just want it, and then we would never be able to eat it all. So it was really lovely to know I was there longer and could sort of pace myself with buying ingredients. But in terms of the space, it was definitely a learning to cook in that space, especially with two children around. My youngest was only just one when we left, and so she was still crawling around. So you'd have like this little tiny corridor where I would stand to cook. I was right in the middle between the sort of sitting area and where you came into the van, and the back of it where our toilet was. So that, you would have to just squeeze past each other the whole time. Which is why I said I quite like to send them all outside and try and have it free to cook. But only one person could really cook. There wasn't enough space to have more than one person cooking. And I feel like it just became a kind of a dance that we kind of learnt in the end. We just got into that rhythm of how it worked when someone was cooking, and how to get past each other or move out the way. And and the great thing about the tiny space was that everything was in reach. So I literally could just reach into all my cupboards from where I was, and the fridge was directly behind where I stood to cook at the burners. So once you open the door of the fridge, then that completely blocked the corridor. So it was quite a juggle, but I don't really remember. I don't know whether this is me looking back with sort of rose-tinted spectacles, but I don't really remember it for the majority being a problem. It was an enjoyable thing to do, and we just sort of figured it out, really.
Did you have staples that you kind of relied on, that you knew you could just go in and produce for dinner, that you kind of repeated, that made it easier?
I can't. It's going back a while now, so I try and think back. But we definitely had like store cupboard staples, because we had to be aware of if for some reason we couldn't get to a shop to buy food or a market, we had to make sure that we were covered. But I definitely preferred to use fresh ingredients. I feel like we would have probably continued having eggs quite a lot at kind of breakfast time. But I really enjoyed just sort of absorbing what was in season where we were, or the region. Certainly in France, even the supermarkets in France, you move from one region to the next, and there's a real sense of change in the supermarket. So, particular regions that make a lot of pâté and terrines, you suddenly see all those in the supermarket, and then you go somewhere else and they disappear, and there would be something else that's particular to that place. So I just really enjoyed kind of going with what was, I guess, those kind of, like you said, the sort of staples of what I knew how to cook, but then taking this inspiration from and changing things out for whatever was sort of available and interesting and a bit different.
I know that you cooked homemade pizza in the van, which astounds me, like no oven and a chopping board space and 2 burners. And we're both, Andrew and I, are both really excited that we're going to get you on video showing us how to do it, because you used, I believe, your cast iron pan. So maybe you could just give us a little brief walkthrough of how you did it, and then if people want to come and watch you do it, we will have you showing us on video, actually in the van, I hope.
Yeah, we're going to
which we'll be recording next week. They're really exciting. So we'll actually see the kitchen, we'll see that beautiful cast iron stove, and we'll see you making pizzas. So tell us, I can't even imagine it. How did you do that in that little space?
So I think the inspiration came from a Jamie Oliver book called Jamie's Italy, where he talked about fried pizza. And many, many years ago, I think before we had children, back when I feel like we have more time to experiment with these things, I remember trying this fried pizza, and I think that just must have popped into my head at some point, and I just sort of tried it my own way based on that idea. So we would roll out the dough and then dry fry it in the cast iron pan. So a bit like a flatbread, really. And then I'd have that on one of my hobs, and on the other burner I would have my pizza sauce, so it would be hot. And then once the dough was cooked on both sides, I would turn the heat down as low as possible, put the sauce on, and the mozzarella in quite small sort of chunks so that it had a better chance of melting quickly. And then I just put a lid on it and just gave it enough time that I wasn't hopefully burning the bottom of the dough that was in contact with the cast iron, but with the lid on, hopefully enough heat to melt the cheese. And because the pizza sauce was already hot, that was it, really. So quite simple. Nothing, I didn't try out any other kind of toppings, but just based on those principles, that really all I was needing to do was melt the cheese at that point.
Your girls must have loved that.
It was great fun, especially, as I said, we didn't have an oven, so we didn't miss having an oven at all. I think there's a lot of people living in vans who feel that their oven is really essential for them, but we didn't miss it at all. And we found a way with with pizza. So, and we still can.
Since you shared that with me, several people have come and asked me about it. So I think I've been through stages of my life without an oven when I've moved house, and I think it's something that people are interested in doing, because it's not, other cultures did cook flatbreads, like you said, on the stove top, and it is totally possible. So having said that, I can't imagine doing it in such a small space. So. And I really want to look inside your van. So I'm really excited for next week to actually see how those kind of come together on the stove and watch you do your thing with it. So thank you ever so much for getting the van up and recording that for us. Let's talk about fermenting, because I know that before you went, when we connected, both of us were trying to eat a kind of a Western Price style diet, and so that's the good ingredients, the good fats, but also fermenting. Did you manage to do any fermenting in that small space?
It was one of those things I set off on my van adventure with very good intentions, that I was going to certainly do my milk kefir. So I took some milk kefir grains with me in a jar, and I believe they spent maybe even the full 2 years in the back of the fridge unused.
Oh,
there were two things to it. I think that, well, partly we had quite a hard start to it, and fermenting things was just not a priority. But aside from that, I think the temperature would have been, the temperatures around something like milk kefir would have been really tricky, in the sense that we headed into the south of France and then across Italy in like July and August, and it was like 40 degrees in that van at some points. It was unbearable, and I can't really I think you'd have fermented kefir in about an hour at that temperature. So I think that would have been really tricky, and potentially just the constant travel, so you're constantly having to clear down all the sides. So we would have had to like have somewhere specific, I think, to make sure it was properly secure while we were driving. So I think that would have made it tricky. And the other element for me was that just there was such good access to those kinds of food everywhere we went, really, certainly in France. And I'm trying to think about Italy. There probably were in Italy, and then certainly in like Germany there were fermented vegetables, because they're obviously big on those sorts of food. But yeah, there was just such good access to like certainly fermented dairy, like cheese and yogurt and creme fraiche in the markets, that I just didn't really feel that in the end that there was a need to do it. So
yeah, I get that. And I didn't even think about you having to secure them down when you were driving. I think about the amount of times we've moved, and really every time we've moved, we've had a cool bag with us, and it's had jingling bottles of water kefir and sauerkraut in it that generally Rob is carrying while we're on a train with suitcases and goodness knows what else. And we've had several disasters where water kefir's just spilt everywhere or sauerkraut spilt everywhere. And so, yeah, when you're driving, of course you can't leave water kefir out or milk kefir out on the side. Of course not. Andrea said to me before we got together to record this that she wanted to know if you had any kitchen disasters, and this feels like the moment to ask about whether anything went really wrong or there was something funny you can tell us about.
So I spoke to my husband about this one because I felt like I was struggling to think of things to start with, and then I thought, like, that surely can't be true. But there were really we had lots of van disasters, so maybe they just overshadowed other things. But there were a few, not necessarily kitchen disasters, but food related moments. So I'd bought this beautiful mushroom soup in a bottle, because a lot of things like that in France are in glass bottles, it was in a cupboard, and a low down cupboard, but it was still sort of one shelf up, and I knocked that out and it shattered over the floor, and that kind of like mushroomy grey brown stuff just going all over the floor. And that was when I was on a solo trip 6 weeks with my girls, so I had to deal with glass, and I was just mortified at this sort of very expensive soup that I've been so looking forward to having, a meal that was made for me. And so that was really upsetting. And then there were two that came to mind, moments of very expensive mistakes in France. So my husband had a very expensive mistake in a market with some very nice ham, but he asked for it in slices, and this very jolly French producer of this very beautiful ham cut the thickest slices, and I think we had like 2 slices of this kind of cured ham, and it cost maybe like €15, which was at the time really eye-watering when you're sort of trying to stick to a sort of a budget. And we had another moment like that in France at a butcher's. They had this beautiful vegetable soup, and we misread or misheard the amount it was per whatever like measurement it was, and we came out and looked at our receipt, and we actually went back in because we thought they'd got it wrong. And so for this pot of soup to feed the 4 of us, I think it was €30.
Oh my gosh.
Which was just like, we just couldn't believe that there hadn't been a mistake made. But obviously by that point we bought it, so there was nothing we could do. And it was very, very good. But yes, those were some painful, expensive food mistakes.
I know that we've made that mistake before, going to markets, and there's different languages, there's different accents, and you think you caught what they said, but you're kind of worrying about how much to buy anyway, and you want it, and so you just buy it, and then you're like, oh dear, I wasn't expecting that. So I've been there and done that.
I think
I wanted to Yeah.
So I was just going to say, I think after that we very quickly learnt the word for thin slice in French, so that we could be very specific about what we were asking for when it came to slices of ham.
Yeah, completely. I wanted to ask, you said earlier, that you wanted to use the ferment, you wanted to make ferments, and you set out with all those intentions, but really when you saw the actuality of how you were living, it wasn't your priority, and you could buy them anyway. And I think really from the whole trip, when I imagined doing that, I imagine I'd have all these ideas of what I wanted to do. But actually, when you do those things, when you're in the van, you realise what's important for you and what you want to prioritise. And I'm wondering, looking back on those years of travel, what did you find out was really important to you around nourishing yourself and your family?
I think that what really came out for me, and certainly having this opportunity to reflect on on that experience by doing this interview with you, is just how like that joy around eating. I just look back on that period with just so much like excitement and joy and passion for the foods that we found and experienced, and that's kind of regular access to excellent quality food from people that just so care about what they're making just makes such a huge difference for me in terms of sort of the ease of meal planning, preparation, being guided by what's available. I just feel like I really work well, with those kind of parameters, and I definitely resonate with what you said about your move to Italy and part of, that being around the food, because definitely back in the UK now, I just feel that I just have lost a bit of that, in terms of what's this overabundance. I can go to the supermarket or the shop and there's just every food from everywhere whenever I want it, and I find that really tricky. I would much rather, I didn't have narrow choices when we were traveling. There was still abundance of things, but there was just a different sense to it, that regionality, seasonality, local food, and it was that ease of access to it. It was really, I guess, because we were traveling as well. We would shop every few days because we didn't have very much space in the fridge, and I have to drive really far now to find those producers that I know, and I have to do it every couple of weeks, and such a different way to cook and meal plan than what I got when we travelled. So
yeah, again, I totally resonate with that. I think I was scribbling down some things while you were talking. I think that greatly constraints create creativity. When we only have a certain number of things to work with, we find ways to work with them that we wouldn't if we were looking at a great big supermarket with all these different choices in there. And also that regionality, it brings sort of passion back. I know that a simple example of me here is broccoli, because in the UK, as you know, if you go into a supermarket, you can buy broccoli all the year round. You can just get your broccoli, and you can have broccoli any day of the year. Whereas here, broccoli literally disappears, and the whole summer there's no broccoli. And then I'm on cloud 9 when the broccoli comes back in the late autumn here, because I'm like, yay, broccoli's back, and I can do stuff with this broccoli. And when that happens to all the different foodstuffs, it, like you said, it turns meal planning on its head, because you're working with something that's fresh and new, and rather than just being bombarded by everything and kind of going almost robot-like over it. That's my experience with it, for sure. I want to know why you came back home, because despite all the problems that you've kind of hinted at, and it sounds like you had kind of problems with the van, and it's a huge learning experience. I can't imagine how how many things are tested by putting 4 of you and packing you into a van like that. But I wonder what drove you to come back to the UK after your travels?
There are a couple of things that I think just came together at the time that we decided we would come back. So one of those was money and finances, as I mentioned.
Okay.
My business was, the income from that was covering a good percentage of what we were spending, but not all of it. So we were diminishing our savings. So that kind of practical reason was definitely part of it. My husband, who I mentioned had stopped working, he discovered on our travels that he really likes working, and that he wanted to work again, and he had managed to do a bit of freelance stuff at various points. Like over the winter, we'd rented a gîte in France, and we'd done some house sitting and things. So he'd had some chance to do some freelance work, but he was keen to get back into work again, really. So that was another part of it, and I guess those were probably the big practical reasons. And in terms of why the UK, I think we both set off on that journey really hoping we were going to find somewhere abroad that we wanted to settle down and start a new life, and we just didn't. There was always practical reasons or other kind of heart reasons that sort of that nowhere just felt quite right. And in the end, when we left the UK, I had some new, really kind of growing friendships with other women, and in terms of coming back, I just felt like I wanted to come back to where we'd left, which I think was a shock to both of us. We just didn't think we were coming back to the kind of Manchester area, and I was drawn back by those friendships, and it just felt like that was the right thing to do right now at that moment. And I guess our travels changed our perspective on life in that sense that before we went, I think we felt like we're getting older, we've got all these dreams. If we don't do them right now, then we'll never do them. And I think our travels and our journey that we took showed us that that's not the case, that we can do what feels right now, and it might be different in a year or 5 years, and then we'll reassess, and we'll change and take a different path if it feels right in that moment. So we're back here in the area that we lived in before we left, and it feels like I feel really content here at the moment. I don't imagine that we'll stay here like long term or forever, but it feels good at the moment. And part of coming back to living in a house for me was that I was hopeful that I would be able to do like longer trips with my daughters without my husband. I home educate, so I have that flexibility. But just before COVID happened, in the sort of January and February of 2020, I did 6 weeks on my own with the girls in Europe. And I think I did about 6 countries, and it was an amazing experience to realise I could do it on my own. And Nick came to visit us for the end of that, and that was really fun. And I was hoping that when I came back, I would have this kind of mixture of the things we love about living in a house, so wanting pets and chickens and vegetable garden, but I would also have this opportunity to go on these kind of month or 2 month kind of trips to Europe. And as we all know, that's not been possible the last few years, so maybe one day.
I hope so. I hope you'll be able to do that again. I think it's a beautiful piece of learning that you express, that you wanted to be able to find a new home, and you had the idea that we have to do it now, and then to have the perspective of, well, no, we don't have to do it now. We still do have time. We can live day by day and choose in any moment what's right for us. And that's something that I've I've experienced, I think, a lot before I had my son, thinking that, time was passing on, and I'm going to have a son, and I need to be able to do these things, and feeling the passing of time. Whereas now although we've settled here in Italy, I don't know whether we'll be here forever. And I'm open to there being a time in however many years' time where we might be in a different country, where we might be back in the UK. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be, I know what my future is and I know where I'm going to be. It's okay to go with the flow more, which I think is what you were saying, which is nice. Is there anything else, just generally from the trip, that you feel you learned that you would like to share?
I think we all learnt how to be more resilient. So, as an example, well, sort of an example of what I mean by that, any time at the very sort of the first few months of our trip, whenever we had a problem with the van or, challenges, me and my husband just didn't cope very well. We descended into arguments. It was the end of the world. We're just not in a great place. We just didn't handle any kind of challenging situation very well at all. And then at some point, we just noticed that we were handling those things so much better. And that's what I mean by resilience. So somewhere in Italy, I think sort of down Tuscany way, we'd gone up a rather large hill/mountain to stay at the top for a bit, and on the way down something snapped in the van and we didn't know what we were going to do. My husband managed to fix it with a cable tie and some other piece of something or other, and he managed to coast us down the other side of this hill in second gear into a town, and managed to sort of roll us into a garage and where we got fixed. But I just remember this like sense of calm, like it's okay, we'll figure this out. Whereas, at the first few months it would have been like, we would have thought that, just the world was ending, and that sense of resiliency and I think to a great degree we've brought that back into our lives, and I just feel that is such a blessing, really, to be able to handle situations better, and to feel more resilient to whatever comes along, which I think definitely stood us in really good stead when COVID hit, because we spent the first 3 months of that lockdown in a campsite in the van, my husband starting his work, and he did his first 2 days of work from the car, so it just really helped with, I just see how valuable that learning is in all aspects of our life. And what you touched on previously about constraints and kind of limitations, I really need those, and I'm still trying to figure out how I bring those into living in a house in a urban environment in England, where I've got, turn on a tap or switch on a light and everything is sort of fairly endless or limitless. I really miss those kind of limitations that were put on us by living in a van. And it seems so much harder to implement them into your life. A bit like the endless choice of food, really. So that's definitely something I've learnt, but something that I'm still sort of working on, in how to bring that into my life now. So, I think those are some of the key sort of learnings for me. So,
really nice reflections. I remember when I came back from travelling in Russia a long time ago, and I'd been in places where they'd have completely off the land and had big vegetable gardens and animals, and sheared the sheep and made their own clothes with the wool. And I walked into a supermarket in the UK a couple of days after I got back, and I just looked at all the shelves of polystyrened meat, and I had to leave the shop because I was just like, I can't cope with this. This is not right. And I feel like, those constraints can help make us into much more creative and stronger people. And the other thing you said about constraints is that it's hard to bring them into our lives, and the spiritual teachings that I've followed over the last few decades, so many of them have said, stop having lots of choices. The less choices you have, the easier your life becomes, and the more in integrity you're able to be. And I think that's the work of a lifetime, to narrow our constraints in a society that just wants to show us choices at every stage. And those choices aren't necessarily, the ability to choose isn't necessarily the right thing for us, I think, as humans, because we wouldn't necessarily have had that in the past. Anyway, that's a whole nother discussion. We are getting close to time, and I have one more question for you, which is about your space again. In that there are a lot of people who come to us at the podcast who want to eat ancestrally, who want to eat good food, but they've got very, very small spaces. And considering what you went through, I would love to hear what you would say to those people who have small spaces and want to eat well.
This felt like quite a challenge to think what my sort of advice might be. I feel like the obvious one would be, and I'm sure it's come up on your podcast before in terms of advices around like prioritizing things, but I don't feel like I'm very good at prioritizing. I want to do everything. I want to have all the ferments, and so I'm not sure that I can give that as one of mine, because I just don't feel like that I wholeheartedly want to go in with prioritizing. So I think what was interesting from this question was that back in the house now where we live, we are in a sort of fairly standard semi-detached kind of 1930s house in England, but I actually have a really small kitchen, and it's beautifully made by the previous owners, but it's actually really tiny. And I remember when we came to look round it, I was like, oh, I'll be fine in here because it's not much bigger than the van kitchen. And I think we've actually got less storage in this kitchen than in our van kitchen.
Gosh.
So I'm not sure I am so enthusiastic now that I've actually been living in it for over a year that it's so small. But it helped me to think about it, because I am still dealing with a fairly small kitchen. So I think things from van life that helped, like how I approach it now, is just how much you can maximize your space. And I would love a kitchen that had like sort of clear shelves with like some nice things on them, and but actually I need to make the most of the wall space, and so I'm slowly adding in bits and pieces, shelves or things like that. We seem to be slowly adding to it because we need the storage space. When we built our van, you make the most of absolutely every inch. So trying to remember that and use that as I approach my kitchen, it's definitely been helpful. I think trying to get creative with your space. So the previous owners left this. It's like a giant green tent that is in our garden. It's apparently people use them as like a bit like a garage or sort of shed. The previous owners had like a gym in it, but we actually have put a chest freezer in there because we've bought half a pig the last 2 autumns from a local producer, and without that space we just couldn't store things like that, or bones, and so it's not ideal, but it works. So I think any ways that you can sort of add in those bits in unusual places, perhaps. We just have to shove stuff here, there, and everywhere. I don't have space. I don't think I'd want to put the chicken food outside at the moment, so I've just bought 2 huge sort of sacks of chicken food, and they're just going to go under a small table in the corner of our dining room, because that's just that's just where it is. And I guess it's just a juggle and trying to relinquish some of that desire for a very nice, perfect looking kitchen, but it's just got to be practical and just fit those things in wherever possible. And I think my final thought on it was, again, looking back at van life, was streamlining what you have, which for me in a house is still very much a work in progress. And by that I mean like what gadgets and stuff you have, that take up space. And I didn't have like electrical power in the van, so I just had a hand whisk and I had a moolie that I could make soup with if I wanted to sort of blend something up. And we only had enough cutlery and plates for what we needed, which we've got more of those things now that we're back in a house. But I think that's one way that you can definitely, that you could, is sort of cut down on things that you maybe have more of than you really need or use. And I'm slowly trying to whittle away at sort of the kitchen gadgets that I had pre-travels, and what I actually use and what I actually need. And, can I do it, like, can I combine it some way with one thing or get rid of it totally? And so, yes, I think those were the key ones that I could think of.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you want to add that I haven't asked or that's come up before we close?
I don't think so. Just that it's been so lovely to dive into, to bring it all up and reminisce over this life that I had that feels quite a long time ago now. So
thank you so much for sharing it. It's not something that Andrea and I have done, so it's been fascinating to hear how you did it and your experiences of the different countries, for sure. And I'm really excited to look inside the van and see the beautiful stove and watch you making pizza. I'm sure you're going to make me hungry. We will put the details of how to access that video recording that Charlie's going to do with us in the show notes, so you can get that. Tell us where people can find you, Charlie.
So I think probably the key ones of interest might be around our van adventures. So we have a blog which is called babybusadventures.com, and an Instagram by the same name, so at babybusadventures. They're not so well updated at the moment because we haven't been doing a lot of travelling, but there's quite a lot of information on there. I've done posts on my favourite farmers market. I guess they're just generally markets in France, and I've done posts on all the places that we stayed in France and Italy and all the other countries we've visited. So that's got a lot of information on that. And then I probably would like to mention that I do have a podcast myself, although I've only done a few episodes and neglected it for a while. But I would really like to get back into it. And that's called the Exploring It Families podcast. And it's around families who are making or have made life-changing journeys or, big life changes. So that really stemmed out of meeting amazing people through our journey, and not just people in vans, but all different kinds, people on all different kinds of journeys. And they were just such interesting conversations I had with those people. I just felt like they needed to be shared. So there's a few episodes on there at the moment, and I'd really like to try and get back into it and share some more of those stories from people I know out there that have done some really interesting things.
We will link those in the show notes. Tell us also about your business, because for people in the UK, it can be a really useful resource.
So I run a eco wedding directory called the Natural Wedding Company. It's actually just turned 15, so I've been doing it for quite a long time now. And it's like just an eco version of a wedding directory. So it lists all the kind of suppliers that you might be looking for a wedding, but all the people, all the businesses that I list have an eco or ethical kind of basis to their business. So there are a few. I've got one in Italy, and there are some that sort of do worldwide services. So yeah, it's a really lovely business and really interesting suppliers that I work with. So
wonderful. We'll put a link to that in as well. Okay, well, I think we're done. I'm looking forward to recording and seeing in the van. Thank you ever so much for your time, Charlie, and for sharing all the different aspects that you did about your trip. And yeah, here's hoping you can get back in the van with your girls soon.
Yeah, well,
really
thank you.
So. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for listening. We'd love to continue the conversation. Come find us on Instagram. Andrea's at Farm and Hearth and Alison's at ancestral_kitchen. Until next time, we both wish you much fun, exploration and satisfaction in and out of the kitchen.